Welcome back to Outside Views, and the return of Brexit as a political battle cry is the most predictable and, frankly, the most depressing development in British politics right now. It was always going to happen, and for years the word itself was nearly taboo in the UK, a political third rail that neither major party dared to touch because the argument over leaving the European Union had been so conflict-ridden and so utterly exhausting. But you can only ignore a giant gaping hole in the middle of your economy for so long before someone is forced to point at it. And now it's back, not as a celebration of sovereignty, but as a weapon of political warfare, a desperate attempt to assign blame for what everyone now knows is a terrible, costly mistake. The simple truth is the economic forecasts are sinking, the grim long-term costs of isolation are undeniable, and the ruling party has finally been cornered into admitting the elephant is in the room. And the current government, the Labour government, as I told you last week already, is now openly pointing the finger, laying the blame for the severe consequences of leaving the European Union squarely on the architects of the hardest possible break, the right-wing populists who championed it. And they are essentially saying, this pain? This is your fault, Nigel Farage and your ideological allies. And it's about time they did. Because for too long, the economic reality of Brexit has been masked by global events, first the pandemic, then the war in Ukraine, and the subsequent energy crisis. But now, those external distractions are receding and the homegrown Brexit damage is starkly, brutally exposed. And this is not mere speculation. The numbers are too big to hide. We just heard from the UK's own Chancellor of the Exchequer, their Finance Minister Rachel Reeves, speaking during the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund, no less. And she didn't hedge her words. There is no doubt that the impact of Brexit is severe and long-lasting. And more pointedly, she added that the UK's existing productivity problems have been exacerbated by the way the country left the EU. And this is a high-ranking government official effectively admitting that the foundational promise of Brexit, that it would unleash economic potential, was a complete fantasy. It's an admission that the specific hardline route chosen was the worst possible outcome, although I disagree with there. If Nigel Farage really got what he wanted, it would have been even worse. But turning a bad idea into an absolute economic catastrophe is what we saw. It's not just the Treasury acknowledging this. The junior ministers are echoing the despair. Chris Bryant, the Secretary of State for Trade, spoke openly of a permanent Brexit damage and confirmed London's urgent desire for a reset in trade relations with the EU in general and with Germany in particular. They want to make trade as smooth as possible again. But here's the kicker. The point that proves this whole thing was a colossal waste of time and energy. They are running into obstacles in this attempted reset. And of course they are. The very nature of Brexit was to introduce obstacles. You cannot leave the club, tear up the rulebook, and then politely ask to be treated like a full member again, simply because the economic reality of being an outsider has become politically inconvenient. The EU is not going to unilaterally remove the regulatory friction and customs checks that are currently choking British exports, because those checks are the very mechanisms that protect the single market. The entire point of the single market is that trade is frictionless because all members adhere to the same standards, the same rules, the same mutual recognition of qualifications and goods. The UK chose to reject that fundamental pact in favor of sovereignty, which has translated into the necessity of divergence, setting its own rules. And when you diverge, you create a border. And every single political skirmish now is about trying to mitigate the damage from a decision that was supposed to bring benefit. It's just a cycle of absurdity. And this so-called permanent damage is the 4% permanent reduction in productivity relative to remaining in the EU. And that's a figure that has been repeatedly confirmed by the UK's own Office for Budget Responsibility. And that 4% is not just a line on a chart, it is a life tax on the entire population, meaning less money for public services, lower wage growth, And yes, we've seen that in high demand areas where the wage was growing far too much and hence the inflation. But overall, there will be lower wage growth and less competitive businesses for decades. And the reason this political fight is back now is precisely because the public is finally connecting the dots between the economic stagnation and the decision made in 2016. The rising cost of living, the lack of inward investment, the ongoing struggles of exporters, it all points back to the self-imposed barriers. And it's my personal view that this political deflection is utterly cynical, even if it is factually correct in assigning blame to the hardliners. The current government knows deep down that the only way to genuinely make trade smooth again is to move closer to the EU's orbit, to embrace some form of regulatory alignment, or even contemplate rejoining the single market or a customs union, which is close to impossible, but still. But to utter those words is still an act of political suicide, a betrayal of the referendum result that continues to hold a near religious significance for a portion of the electorate. So instead of tackling the cause, the trade and cooperation agreement's inherent friction, they are attacking the symptom. The politicians who insisted on the harshest version of that agreement. It's a necessary political move, of course, and perhaps to clear the board, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. The sheer volume of non-tariff barriers, the endless paperwork, the complexity of the rules of origin requirements, the time-consuming veterinary and customs checks has rushed small and medium-sized enterprises, those so-called SMEs, and also crushed them. And a recent study highlighted that the trade and cooperation agreement has caused massive disruptions, leading to sharp decline in both UK exports and imports with the EU, and crucially, a significant reduction in the variety of goods being traded. When a small firm exporting specialized machine parts or cheese and then stops bothering to sell to its closest market because the paperwork costs more than the profit, that is a direct measurable loss to the national economy that no trade deal with Australia can ever compensate for. And the damage is compounding. And Brexit didn't just happen once. It's a continuous ongoing process of divergence, plus there are still transitional periods in place. And every time the UK chooses to set a slightly different standard for chemicals, data, or financial services, it adds another brick to the invisible trade wall, a result of the sovereignty they fought so hard to reclaim. The idea that this regulatory autonomy would unleash a wave of British innovation has been proven false. Instead, it has created a regulatory muddle that frustrates businesses and chills foreign investment. Why would a global company set up its European headquarters in the UK if it means navigating a separate and divergent rulebook just to sell into the world's largest market next door? And the reduced attractiveness of the UK as an investment destination is another key piece of this permanent damage. And the political blame game is also focusing on the damage to the UK's labour supply. The shift in immigration rules, while achieving the political goal of taking back control of the borders, has created acute labour shortages in critical sectors like healthcare, logistics and agriculture. The lack of available workers, particularly in lower skilled but essential roles, is another significant drag on productivity and has contributed to wage inflation and supply chain bottlenecks. And it's another hidden yet severe cost of the way Brexit was implemented, and another piece of the permanent economic damage that the government is now seeking to assign blame for. It's an inescapable irony that the supposed cure for the UK's problems, leaving the EU, has become the single greatest impediment to fixing them. The political energy that should be focused on the National Health Service, on education reform, or on long-term climate strategy is constantly pulled back into a quagmire of post-Brexit trade management. The current government is stuck in a loop. They need to demonstrate that they are getting trade moving again, but their hands are tied by a political mandate, the 2016 vote, that is directly opposed to the economic logic of trade integration. They talk about a reset, but the EU's response is, and will remain, perfectly rational and firm. They will not sacrifice the integrity of the single market for the political convenience of a third country that chose to leave. And meaningful smoothing of trade will require the UK to accept conditions like adhering to EU standards or accepting EU jurisdiction that look suspiciously like the very things they voted to leave. And that is the ultimate political battle cry they are trying to avoid. They are essentially arguing that the idea of Brexit wasn't wrong, just the execution by the other side. And I find this disingenuous. The economic model of a hard Brexit, the one championed by the Farage wing, was always going to be disastrous because it confused the right to make rules with the practicality of selling things. No matter who was in power, the minute those regulatory barriers went up, the economic pain was guaranteed. So, while it's politically savvy for the new government to blame the hardliners, the larger, more honest truth is that the whole enterprise was a mistake and the economic consequences are now coming home to roost. The political battle cry is back because the economic truth has become too loud to ignore. And it's not just a warning for the UK, as I told you a few days ago. It's a global cautionary tale about what happens when ideology trumps economics and when a country chooses isolation over integration. Every politician everywhere who campaigns on a platform of protectionism and pulling up the drawbridge needs to look at the UK today. They need to see a once stable, globally integrated economy now mired in a perpetual argument about how to mitigate permanent damage. They need to understand that the sovereignty gained came at the cost of genuine prosperity and international influence. And this battle cry is a mournful sound, the noise of a country finally confronting the self-inflicted costs of an irreversible decision. And the irony is, the harder they fight the political battle over who is to blame, the less time and energy they have to actually fix the underlying economic mess. The only way to move past Brexit is to move closer to the EU, which is the very thing they are currently waging a political battle not to do. It's a depressing loop of political denial and economic reality, and it's why this issue will continue to dominate the UK for years to come. And this battle cry is less about the future and more about desperately trying to escape the shadow of the past. And I'm really looking forward to your comments about this. And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.